Ladies and gentlemen, Annabelle Gurwitch and Richard Dawkins.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Boulder. It's very exciting to be here, and I want to say, I know this isn't your first stop on the American tour, but before I got here this evening, I'm sure like many of you, I think it's safe to say in this crowd, I was listening to NPR. And I heard the singer-songwriter Bonnie Raitt describe the times that we're living in as weary and dreary. I tend to think of it as terrifying and apocalyptic, but it seems like a tremendously opportune time to have this visit from you and to celebrate and talk about and explore science and reason. So thank you so much for coming over and visiting us. So I'm going to just tell you about the idea of what we're going to do for this first hour of conversation. What I did was I put out a call on Twitter for questions for Richard, and I thought this would be fun to give people who weren't here tonight a chance to ask questions. So I'm going to ask you a few questions that I've gathered from around the country, and then I have questions that I've been saving up for many years now to ask Richard. And we'll have our discussion, and then we'll move into the questions from the audience, as Robin noted. And what I'm planning to do is to go from starting our dialogue about science and ideas, and then moving to the issues and challenges of our times. Just I'm letting you know that. So if you're thinking, why isn't she asking about what's happening in the country right now? I'm getting there. We're going to get there. So the first question, Richard, came from someone on Twitter who said, as long as we fear death and loss, will we always believe in God?
I find it rather odd that fearing death should make you want to go on living forever. I mean, maybe a couple of 100 years would be nice, but forever? I mean, billions and billions of years when the sun burns up and you're still going on playing your golden harp. I think what is terrifying...
It would be hard with arthritis. You'd have some by then.
Right.
Very painful.
Well, the other question is, when you go to heaven, what age are you? Do you go back to the age of 25, or do you go to heaven as a geriatric, senile old fool? I think that if there's something terrifying about death, it's not death. What is terrifying is eternity. And eternity is even more terrifying if you're there than if you're not. I want to spend eternity under a general anesthetic. And that's what's going to happen.
And we're heading that direction because cannabis will be legal soon in many more places. We will all be, yes, like we are here. Okay.
It's already legal in Colorado, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And it is in Los Angeles.
I remember that. I think I was in Colorado when that happened, and it was the same time as gay marriage was legalized. And I heard a woman make a speech, and she said, this is very appropriate, because it says in the book of Deuteronomy, if a man lie with another man, they shall be stoned.
I'm getting a contact high from the crowd right now. So here's an oldie but goodie. What is your strongest argument against the existence of God?
Well, which God, for a start? My strongest argument against the existence of God is the same as my strongest argument against the existence of leprechauns. There is no evidence for either. That's all you need say. It is the onus is on somebody who wants to believe in leprechauns or Baal or God or Mithras or Zeus or Thor or Allah to find the reason why. There is no reason, so we don't believe.
Okay. How long do you think it will take the religious to evolve? And do you think What will they evolve into? They could evolve a different way, more terrifying. Do you think that it will happen in your lifetime?
I wouldn't use the word evolve. That's too pessimistic because evolution takes millions of years. And I want this to happen in historical time, preferably in my lifetime. We are moving in the right direction. In Western Europe, the number of religious people is actually now rather few. In America, it is still a majority, but the majority is shrinking. The number of people who are classified as none, N-O-N-E, is now above 20%, and it's above 30% if you take young people. So already we, the non-believers, are as large as any other individual religion. And we're moving in the right direction, and the demographics are on our side.
I want to get back to that in a moment before we leave this realm of ideas about what we're seeing, the trends we're seeing in this country right now. But we were just talking about this, which I do think is an interesting question. What do you think we will evolve as a species into?
That's possibly the commonest question I get asked, and I never quite know what to say.
Is AI, is that
that's another question, which is very interesting. If you're talking about biological evolution, then that usually takes rather a longer time than we're used to dealing with. So if you were to ask the question something like, the trend for the past 3 million years since Australopithecus, since Lucy, has been towards larger brains. So you might hope that perhaps that trend will continue, and in another 3 million years, we'll all have brains the size of the Mekong. That can only happen if in succeeding generations, first of all, there's genetic variation in brain size or intelligence, whatever it is. And secondly, if the most intelligent, the brainiest individuals are the ones who have the most children.
Well, that's not happening.
So I don't think we can look forward to a continuation of the trend of the past 3 million years. The environment in which we now live, if there's any natural selection going on, it's a very odd kind of natural selection. The environment of the past was one in which it was rather difficult to reach adulthood. Most people died young, and therefore survival was the important criterion for whether you reproduced and passed on your genes. Nowadays, it's rather difficult to die young, at least in Western society. Medical science keeps us alive.
Oh, we're working on that here in America.
Yes.
I do think that the mortality, I think that we've lowered our lifespan is getting lower here. The trend is actually not
Is that so?
upward. Yes.
Well,
of course, it depends on how much money you have.
Yes. But nevertheless, it's still true to say that survival is not really what the important variable as far as natural selection is concerned. The important variable would be how many children you have, and that's partly how many children you want to have. The sort of joke example would be if a large number of people are born because, or even some people are born because their parents were incompetent with the use of contraception, then if there's any genetic tendency towards incompetence, then we have natural selection by definition in favor of incompetence, whether it's general incompetence or a sort of fumbling at the crucial moment. You can see that it's a facetious example because whatever it takes to be incompetent today is unlikely to be whatever it will take to be incompetent in 10,000 years' time. And so it's not possible to make a general prediction, I think, about what's going to happen to our future. Most species that have ever lived have gone extinct. And so I suppose one should say statistically the most likely future for us is to be extinct, which might be a good thing. I think there's some reason to think that we might escape the fate of the dinosaurs and all the other species that have gone extinct. We have the technology, and so it seems to be quite likely that even a catastrophe as great as the one that killed the dinosaurs might not actually extinguish us, because we would have the technology to send at least some people into underground bunkers and
God, I just hope it takes out Mar-a-Lago, though.
yes.
When that asteroid hits.
But by the way, we also are pretty close to the technology to stop the catastrophe happening in the first place. And if the dinosaurs had had engineers and mathematicians and rocket scientists and telescopes, what could they have done? I mean, it is now just about possible to anticipate the approach of a large asteroid in an orbit that's likely to intercept us, and to send rockets up to deflect it out of its orbit. And funnily enough, it doesn't take much. You only need to accelerate it or decelerate it by less than 1 mile per hour in order to deflect it out of the collision orbit.
Well, that actually is a great segue to my next question for you, which is, for the non-scientists among us, I always describe myself as a C- science student, like most American presidents. We get news in the media of innovations or of research. What is something perhaps we don't know about, or what is exciting to you in science right now? What is a field of research or an innovation that we might not know about that you feel holds hope for us and holds promise?
Well, I'm a biologist, and so I can't really speak for physics, but I think physics is in a very exciting stage at the moment. The findings that are coming out of CERN in Geneva, the experimental physics, I think is opening up new possibilities for physics, and I'm not really qualified to talk about that. But I think it is an exciting time, and I encourage young people who think you're going into physics to do so. In biology, it's all become a matter of molecular genetics, and biology has become a branch of computer science. Molecular genetics is now a digital subject. This would have flabbergasted Darwin, who had no idea about about how utterly digital the whole of life is. It's a remarkable fact that every single living creature that's ever been looked at has the same genetic code. Reams and reams, reels and reels of linear data, just like computer tape, just like modern computer data. It's the same code, the same machine code underlies every single living creature that's ever been looked at. We're all cousins, we all have the same instruction set. The only difference is the instructions that are written in that code. And that's the most remarkable thing. That's happened pretty much in my lifetime. It is in my lifetime, because the Watson and Crick unraveling of the structure of DNA was 1953, and since that time the genetic code has been discovered. We now know the genetic code, and more different species are having their complete genome sequenced. It will be possible, I think, in my lifetime to say that it'll be cheap and easy to sequence any creature you like, and therefore the complete tree of life, the complete pedigree of all life will be at our disposal. We shall know exactly who is a closer cousin to whom. And within humans, of course, it has great potentiality for medicine. At present, doctors are pretty much reduced to prescribing what's the best remedy for a person in general. Some difference between the sexes, some difference between ages, but on the whole, it's the same prescription for the same disease. In the future, the doctor will know your genome, and you will have an individual prescription which is tailor-made for you, for your genes. There are people who, as you know, it's a very bad thing to smoke. You're going to get lung cancer, except that some people are not going to get lung cancer if they smoke. And it would be possible in the future for a doctor to say, you can smoke as much as you like. But that only will apply to a few people, so don't take...
That's why there are edibles. What? I should say You were starting to talk about something that this notion of AI and machines, and we were speaking about this earlier tonight about whether or not that is our ultimate evolution. And when you were talking about how each of us, our DNA makes us a machine with operating instructions, I was thinking, well, so then, as you have said in the past, this evolution potentially of human race evolving into machines, having created them,
yes,
evolve that carbon-based life, perhaps a natural progression.
Okay, yes.
Is that a positive? Is that a negative? Is that something to be feared?
This is a different, yes, that's a very good point, because I was talking about DNA as digital, but of course there's another whole world of the digital, right, which is the silicon world. And it is conceivable, as you say, that artificial machines will come to have human intelligence and will pass the Turing test, will be conscious. And some people fear, I think Elon Musk is one who fears, I think Stephen Hawking is another who fears that there will be a takeover of the robotic creations of our species and that they will supplant us. It's not clear to me that that's necessarily a bad thing. But who knows? I mean, this is pure science fiction at the moment. I suppose philosophically, as a naturalist, I'm committed to the view that it must in principle be possible to replicate anything that humans can do with machines, with silicon-based machines. I think we're a fair way away from that at the moment, but it would be, I think, an act of pure mysticism to say that it's in principle impossible for that to happen.
Well, in a related question, I hope it's not too personal to ask, what is your relationship with the digital world? How much time do you spend looking at screens or online? Do you feel like this is adding to our humanity, as we had hoped that this would expand our world? As we see so many people, it in some sense closes their world, because people find themselves, oh, I'm sorry, I've turned my back to these people over here. And so many people find themselves in a smaller and smaller bubble, having the same conversation with only, people who share the same opinions. So I'm wondering if you think this is increasing our humanity.
Yes, that's interesting. I go back a long way, and I was into computing long before, when you had to actually write programs, and I became addicted to that because it's a very intellectually challenging thing. It's like solving crossword puzzles or chess problems. But you're now talking about a different kind of addiction, which is sitting in front of a screen where you're not actually programming anything. And you make the very interesting point that you are immersed in a bubble of people who are like-minded if you go to certain places on the internet. And
well, you're curating your own universe as opposed to
right,
expanding your world. You're living in a small.
You can expand your world, of course, but it's tempting. I mean, we're a very tribal species, and we come from an origin where we lived in small tribes which were geographically local. And we've now, as it were, substituted a new kind of tribalism. The tribes are no longer geographically delimited. The tribes are now distributed all over the world. But there'll be a tribe of people who are interested in a particular thing and who go to the same websites and to talk to each other and to interact with each other and nobody else. And you get this echo chamber effect. So it's sociologically, anthropologically, very interesting that we're still tribal, but we now have distributed tribes, not geographically circumscribed tribes.
Which is the subject of my book, Tribes and Tribalism, and the difference between the two. I want to talk a little bit about where we are right now in history. So I think for many people, I don't know, you can tell me, am I just speaking for myself? It seems like a rather terrifying time. All right, if you are in the #resistance camp. And what I wondered was, is there some sort of predictive algorithm that would give us some perspective on why, at this point in history, we've seen this rise of nativism. We've seen a rejection of science and a rise of the religious right. Is there something, I mean, we could look to it and say, oh, it's the last gasp of disenfranchised white America, but this is something, or fear all over the world of the same kind of disillusion of culture. But and so it's not just America, it's global, but are we looking at, oh, every couple hundred years, people rebuke science? I mean, is there some historical precedent or pattern that we see? Or are we a one-off anomaly that's just fucking scary?
Well, you began by saying, you began by saying it's terrifying and apocalyptic, and of course it is that. But it's also funny, isn't it? I mean, it's
I said that you can say it's funny because you have health care.
Well,
we
I mean,
are laughing but crying at the same time.
every day you open your newspaper and you think, well, what next? What's the next crazy thing that's... It's almost impossible to believe that he can go any further, and yet every day there's... And I think it's probably good for our health, isn't it, to be a sense of humor about it. I mean, he is a great comic character. But it's tragic at the same time, of course, because climate change is no joke. And as you say, loss of health care is no joke. So it is very, very serious as well. But you're asking whether we're in a sort of downward spiral. Is it just a temporary reversal? I think it's just a temporary reversal. The arc of history, I forget whose phrase that is, Martin Luther King certainly used it, other people have used it. It bends in generally the right direction over the long historical period. Like any historical trend, there are temporary reversals. That it's a sawtooth rather than a smooth rise. Mm-hmm. And we are in a downward part of the sawtooth at the moment, but in 50 years' time, things are getting better. I encourage you to read Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which takes a very broad view of the whole of history and prehistory, and shows that in very, very significant ways we are getting better. We're nicer, we're kinder, we're more civilized than our ancestors were centuries ago, millennia ago. So we're in a temporary reversal at the moment, but it's surely only temporary.
Well, that would, I hope so. I hope so. I think we all hope so. So, as you know, though, we are under attack in a number of areas, and it's hard to know which one to think is the most important, or how to prioritize, or what is the most important pressing issue. So, for instance, last week, the Texas legislature, and you may know this, I think I read it on the Center for Inquiry website. So I'm going to just say it for all of us. So the Texas legislature passed a law last week that for adoption agencies and foster agencies that receive government money, they can now turn prospective parents down based on sex or gender identity and whether or not they are atheists, right? So you got that kind of attack happening. And on the other hand, in March, a group called the Heritage Institute, I hope I'm getting that correct, sent out 300,000 pamphlets to schools across America, age for kindergarten through 12th grade, with a pamphlet entitled "Why Scientists Don't Believe Climate Change is Real." I'm paraphrasing that, but we know that's true. So we see there's this kind of science under attack. There's religious orientation, and well, we know, AG Jeff Sessions stated, secular people have no place in government. I don't know how strong you can't make a stronger statement than that. Which would you which is most important? It's coming in from all directions. What is the bigger threat? Science, religion?
Yeah.
Help us to tell what's important to focus on.
I think it's perhaps a shame to try to identify. I mean, I suppose we'd have to say climate change is the most pressingly serious, and it may already be too late. But that doesn't mean we should neglect these other things. So I think perhaps one of the most serious consequences of Trump's, I put election in quotes, that possibly is climate change, but I'm not sure that I'll be able to talk about that because I have nothing to add to that. I mean, that's clear. Mm-hmm. The Texas example you spoke of, and the idea that secular people have no place in government, that comes close to the heart of what we in the Center for Inquiry and Richard Dawkins Foundation are interested in. Science is getting opposed by religion in those examples. It's getting opposed by big business in the case of climate change. And
isn't there also in some sectors a religious component to that too, that old Gaia theory of the working out of the Earth's?
Yes, Gaia, well, you would know about Gaia theory, that it's this idea that the world is a living organism that takes steps to preserve itself. It was put forward by an Englishman called James Lovelock, and when it first of all appeared, it had a distinctly mystical tone to it. This was most vividly brought home by an incident. The great John Maynard Smith, one of my great scientific heroes, told me this story. He was at a conference in England somewhere, and there was an ecologist in the political sense rather than the scientific sense. And they were talking about the idea that the dinosaurs were driven extinct by a large meteorite that hit the Earth. And the ecologist said, "Impossible. Gaia would not have permitted it." That's the religious aspect of Gaia, but there is a proper scientific aspect as well. How do we get onto that?
Oh, because we were talking about where the attack on science comes from, and in particular climate change. And we were saying it was economy, but from an economic base, from companies.
Oil
but also there's also some religious component. But we were just talking about the issues that are facing us right now, and as you were saying, climate change is probably number one.
I mean, there is a religious aspect to the climate change opposition, which is rather similar to the Gaia would not have permitted it. God would not permit it. And there have been people who've said, we don't need to worry about conservation or anything like that because God promised Noah that never more any of that sort of catastrophe. But mostly I think the opposition to climate change comes from industrial interests who are interested in fossil fuels. But the other thing, the religious opposition to things like gay marriage and to abortion and that kind of thing, interfering in people's lives, forcing their religious beliefs on other people who don't share them. And then the idea you just said that secular people have no place in government. I think that is deeply pernicious. It may not be so immediately dangerous as the climate change opposition, but it's very unpleasant, it's very sinister and very nasty.
As you were saying, though, that is part of your mission at the Dawkins Foundation. So I would love for you to speak to that, about what your personal goals are at this point in your life. You've contributed so much. What do you feel? What is your passion as you move forward? And also for the foundation, what are your immediate goals for that too?
Well, Robin mentioned some of the things. I think she mentioned the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science, teaching middle school teachers, and I'm very passionate about that. Obviously, it's my own field, and I feel that my particular science is especially under threat in this country, and it's ridiculous that this should be so, because the evidence for evolution is not in doubt. I mean, it's just absolutely cast iron evidence. It's as certain as that the Earth orbits the sun. It really is completely certain that evolution is true, and it's terrible that children should be being subjected to falsehoods, which really brings me to my personal concern, which is something which I'm hoping that the Center for Inquiry and the Dawkins Foundation will get onto in a big way, which is the indoctrination of children. There is a presumption that children, the world over, will automatically inherit the religious beliefs of their parents. And I'd love to find a way of raising consciousness to this and try to stop this happening. When you read statistics like, well, not demographic projections, like in the year 2050, France will be a majority Muslim country, that kind of thing. That's entirely based upon demographic projection, on the assumption that every child born to Muslim parents is going to be a Muslim. Why do we assume that? It's a terrible thing to assume. Why do we assume that the children of Christian parents are Christian children?
That's an interesting distinction that you've made, even in the language that we use. I'm sure many of us have read this, that you've said, you've challenged even the language. So you've suggested that instead of saying a Jewish child, a Christian child, we say the child of Jewish family.
Yes.
And that's an interesting way that each of us, should we take that on, can challenge that assumption.
It's use of language. One of the triumphs of feminism has been to change our language so that we don't say one man, one vote. You can't, I mean, you can't say that anymore.
Well, we can't say that in this country anyway. We've given up on that.
So I take great encouragement from the example of feminists who have raised our consciousness. They used the phrase, they invented the phrase, raised our consciousness to the language that we use, the sexist language that we use. I want to raise consciousness to the language that we use when we talk about a Christian child or a Catholic child or a Muslim child, even sometimes a tiny child. And one way to raise consciousness, which I've often used, is to say, would you talk about an existentialist child, a logical positivist child, a Keynesian child, a Marxist child? Of course you wouldn't. But religion gets a free pass, and even those of us who are not religious somehow accept the language Catholic child. You see photographs from the Troubled time in Northern Ireland of, quote, Catholic children being stoned on their way to school by Protestant mobs and vice versa. Those aren't Catholic children, they're children of Catholic parents. Whenever you hear anybody talk about a Catholic child, a Muslim child, a Christian child, stop them, say, how dare you? How dare you label a child with beliefs of its parents when the child is too young to know? Would you talk about a logical positivist child?
I'm interested in that conversation. I'd like to hear that. Anyone who wants to bring that on. Okay, so that actually brings up another issue that I think is interesting. So first of all, I want to make a correction. It was the Heartland Institute that sent out that 300,000 wide pamphlet. The Heritage Foundation is just another conservative organization against climate change. Okay, so when you're talking about that issue you were just saying about children and not making that kind of assumption, so one of the things that I'm wondering about is, it falls under the category of confirmation bias. So it strikes me as amazing that we are having this conversation, as you said, about evolution, whether or not this is an accepted fact, which we know that it is. Somehow or another, we know there are people who cannot see these facts. And even though, for instance, I watched, as many of us have, I'm sure, you discussing with Wendy Wright, the creationist, from women in whatever misguided group that she represents. You presented evidence after evidence when she kept saying there is no evidence of evolution.
Show me the evidence. Show me the evidence.
And no, it was terrifying because terrifying because evidence kept being presented. So, there's that phrase confirmation bias, by which we understand that at a certain point, people they seem to not be able to take in new facts. Everything they hear seems to confirm what they already believe. So what I'm wondering is there any science, any research into where is the moment before the confirmation in that bias occurs? How do we interrupt that? Where do these ideas become fixed? And that has application in terms of children adopting the beliefs of the family they, by the accident of birth, happen to be born into, or who receive a substandard education. How do we interrupt these incorrect or false beliefs? Where does that happen? Is there a sweet spot in the brain?
Confirmation bias is something we're all subject to, I think. I mean, we mustn't be too high and mighty about this. I think we all suffer from it, and we tend to read the New York Times and not read the other side.
I think that's not a correct parody. I'm going to give you some pushback on that.
Okay.
I think for the most part, when you talk about, for instance, the New York Times and other organizations that follow journalistic standards,
yeah.
one comes to depend upon that. We know that there aren't mistakes made. But so yeah, I mean, yes, it's true. There's confirmation bias on every side.
I mean, high journalistic standards, but I just kind of, I don't watch Fox News, and so I'm therefore not kind of in touch with what a large number of Americans are getting. I suppose that isn't really confirmation bias, but I think I'd like to make the point that the scientific method of thinking, the scientific method of going about research, has built-in safeguards against confirmation bias. And this is one of its great virtues. For example, in medical research, the double-blind trial is a very, very powerful technique where you're testing something like a drug against a control. And some patients have the drug and some patients have the control. The double-blind trial method is that neither the patients, nor the doctors, nor the nurses, nor anybody in contact with the patients knows which ones have had the experimental drug, which ones have had the control. And the reason for that is that however much a scientist may wish to avoid confirmation bias, it's almost impossible to do so. It's almost impossible not to, when diagnosing a patient, whether they've improved as a result of the treatment or not to be biased by the fact that you know that they've had the drug or they've had the control. And that's why the double-blind trial is so important and so powerful.
Is there any research, though, into where the brain is most plastic?
No, you're asking me about an educational question, and there may be research, but I don't know. But while on the double-blind trial, there's just a lovely story I'd like to tell. I think I got this from Kendrick Frazier, who's one of the senior people in the Center for Inquiry, the CFI. He was doing a double-blind trial of homeopathy. And so he had a homeopath who was doing treatment, and he did a double-blind trial to see whether the homeopathic remedy was any more effective than the control, and of course it wasn't. Whereupon the homeopath said, "You see, that's why we don't do double-blind trials. They never work."
Oh, okay. I have just a few more questions in this part of our conversation, and one of those, actually, that just reminded me, was from someone in this area who said, okay, you're having this conversation in Boulder, which is the home, and this may or may not be true, of many New Age kind of thoughts and kinds of, I hear a yes or a no, of therapies, and I wonder, if you feel like that is some sort of pernicious virus that has infected us, this idea of, this promotion of energy cures and those kinds of things, and how does that sit with you?
I think it's pernicious. It's mildly pernicious. I don't think it's viciously pernicious. I mean, we have, in the Centre for Inquiry, we have a lot of work going on testing all these claims about womb and ley lines and homeopathy and dowsing and things like that. I think it's important partly because people are led away from genuine medicine by the lure of things like homeopathy, and that can be quite serious. That can be pernicious because they may, for example, not get properly treated for cancer when they could be treated for cancer because they've been persuaded that homeopathic remedies work. So it is pernicious there. But I think it's more that it's a way of thinking which is uncritical. And by fighting against homeopathy and such things, it's rather that we're leading by example and showing what is the proper way to evaluate whether something is true or not. And the proper way to evaluate whether something's true is evidence and only evidence. Evidence properly gathered by scientific means. So
you're not saying that Reiki is the gateway therapy towards not accepting science? I'm just.
Well, I just think all those kinds of things need to be investigated, and the Centre for Inquiry does investigate them. And if they turned out to be genuine, to be good, they would simply become part of medicine. They would become part of scientific medicine. But Reiki, homeopathy, they've never been shown to work. In the case of homeopathy, it more or less couldn't work because there are no molecules of the active substance in the dose. It's been diluted beyond all recognition.
So that brings me to a related question, which is, how do we interrupt what is so often the kind of framing that you encountered, for instance, in your discussion with the creationists? Well, it doesn't work, what you're saying doesn't work for me. When did this idea that science has to have sort of a personal ability, when did that happen, and how did that happen, and why did that happen?
Yes, it doesn't work for me. I mean, that's...
The universe is working to get me a good parking spot.
Exactly.
That kind of thing.
Yes. I mean, there's something so self-centered, so arrogant about that kind of belief. Something that works for me. I've heard doctors say something like, well, the clinical trials are all against it, but in my clinical experience, doctors should never say that. And mostly, I suppose, they don't. But it's very, very hard to talk people out of personal experience. When they have something like an uncanny, spooky experience, the standard thing, you dream about somebody you haven't thought about for 30 years, and then you wake up next morning to find that they've died or sent you a letter or something like that. You can tell people till you're blue in the face that this is happening all over the world. I mean, that people are having dreams all the time. But when it happens to you personally, it's very hard to shake off the conviction that it means something. And time again, when you're arguing against people's superstitions, they will confront you with their own personal anecdotes. Anecdotes are not evidence, and it's very, very hard to get that across to people.
I think if I was going to get a tattoo, because I am tattoo-free, it would be anecdotes are not evidence.
Yeah.
Has a certain ring to it. I think we are moving now to the time in the evening where we're going to have questions. How does that sound, everyone? You ready for that? Fantastic. Okay, I see.
Can we have the lights
people
up?
Moving around. A hubbub has taken over the crowd. not getting interesting enough?
Great.
Good.
Being here, man.
Okay, I think if we quiet down, if we all quiet down and now move quietly, we'll get more questions in. How does that sound? Great. Okay, let's start here.
Hello, no pressure, first question. So I just graduated with a degree in physics and thank you. A common question that physics students get asked is, how long would it take monkeys to randomly type Hamlet? And the answer is many orders of magnitudes longer than the age of the universe. And I mentioned that because you mentioned DNA standing for something, coding for something to build, proteins or whatever. I'm not very good at biology. But a common question or a common defense of religion that I hear is that it's a big deal that DNA stands for something at all. How could that randomly happen, sort of like the monkeys typing Hamlet? And I wonder if you have a critique of that or an answer to that.
As I feared, the way the loudspeakers work is they boom out into the auditorium. It's quite, I think I got it. You began by talking about monkeys typing Hamlet, and then went on to DNA, and I take it the question was something to do with the improbability of getting the right DNA sequence to be functional. Well, the whole point about Darwinian natural selection is that it is nothing to do with monkeys typing Hamlet. It's nothing to do with chance. Chance comes into it only in the offering up of small, minor variations in the genes, in the DNA. And then natural selection takes over. Natural selection picks out that minority of random mutations which work. So if you're talking about, if you use the sort of language of the monkeys and Hamlet, it's as though you think that something really, really complicated, like the vertebrate eye, has to all come together in one fell swoop. And this is a very, very common creationist argument, as you probably know. And it's an entirely false argument because it didn't happen that way, and it couldn't have happened that way. You cannot possibly expect that something as complicated as an eye would all fall into place in one lucky chance step. It happened gradually, step by step. You start off with a very crude approximation to an eye, and you gradually work up, step by step, in a slowly graded, incremented slope. And that really is the answer to the Hamlet being typed by monkeys point. You've got a slightly bigger problem at the origin of life itself.
That's maybe what I was asking, yeah.
Is that what you're talking about?
Right,
okay.
Right.
Well, the origin of life, nobody knows how that happened, and there are various theories. It may only ever be a matter of thinking of plausible hypotheses. There may come a hypothesis which is so plausible that we shall say, oh yes, that's so brilliant, that's got to be true, that's got to be the way it happened. We haven't reached that stage yet. But there isn't, the Hamlet typing, being typed by monkeys stage hasn't been reached yet. Probably the best theory going around at the moment for the origin of life is the RNA theory. DNA, as you know, is a very good replicator, and protein is a very good enzyme. Proteins make very good enzymes. Neither of them is good at the other thing, and which gives rise to a kind of catch-22. RNA is a moderately good replicator and a moderately good enzyme. And so the idea is that RNA started it off in a rather crude way, and then DNA usurped the replication function and protein usurped the enzyme function. And then it became perfected. Once you've got natural selection started, natural selection can get going, and the Darwinian process can produce the sort of extreme perfection we see today.
I want to add one little thing as an actress, that really changes that whole equation, which is many people feel that it wasn't just one Shakespeare who wrote Hamlet, which would change the equation of how amazing it was that this one person wrote Hamlet, and that also the scripts were written through collaboration by the actors. I just feel that's important to note. So we should really retire the one monkey on a typewriter.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Well, thank you so very much for being here. Love the socks, free the socks. But as an aspiring biologist...
Share our views on socks.
Yes, we do.
There we go. As an aspiring biologist, I often use CRISPR in my experiments, and my question has something to do with that. So, what are your thoughts on the evolutionary implications, if any, of genetic engineering technologies like CRISPR, especially in regards to the availability based on wealth and class?
Well, humans have been controlling evolution for a long time using the selection part of the Darwinian equation. It's now becoming possible to use the mutation part of the Darwinian equation and genetically and actually modify genes using the kind of techniques which you do. And you raise a political point, which is that people may be able to buy the privilege of manipulating their genes. And I suppose that is a likely possibility. I can't approve of it, obviously, but I guess the answer to your question is yes.
Yes.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Mr. Dawkins, you are a hero of mine. Thank you. And I would ask you a question, but I would agree with everything you would say. So I'd prefer to ask the audience, who here has, we touched on politics, who here has called their senator in the past 2 or 3 months? Who went to the town hall with Bennett on Friday?
Yes.
The town hall on Friday? I was there. I was ready to ask an atheistic question. If we had this many people show up to those town halls, we would have progress. Thank you.
So you're saying everybody should phone their senator. Is that right?
And show up at town halls.
Show up at town halls.
And also phone other senators too.
This is so important. I mean, they really do listen, and the people with loud voices, the wheel that squeaks gets oiled. The people who are evidence-based, people who are non-religious, people who are skeptical, are enormously numerous in this country. But politicians don't know that. They believe that they have to suck up to the religious, superstitious constituency. And I think it may be a sort of emperor's new clothes phenomenon. It may be that suddenly that everybody will realize, my goodness, the non-religious, the skeptical contingent is very, very numerous indeed, and we just didn't know it. So yes, write to your senator and make a noise.
Call them.
Yes.
Yes.
Hello. You were talking about religious entities and institutions handing out pamphlets and things like that, especially to children and in the general public. Mr. Dawkins, what do you think about entities like Church of Satan or Pastafarians or something who, whenever that happens in a school, they show up to distribute their materials, and kind of the Pastafarians have their show that they kind of mock people with. What do you think of that style of kind of speaking up and preserving atheist rights?
I mean, that's satire. I think it's rather good satire. I think it's amusing. It makes the point that, I mean, the Pastafarian, the flying spaghetti monster.
Noodle ship, yes.
Yeah,
Royal Highness noodle ship.
It makes the point that there is an infinite number of possible gods, and there's no particular reason why anybody should think that their god is privileged. It's the point I made earlier about leprechauns. So I'm amused when I see somebody turning up to swear an oath wearing a colander on their head. I think that ridicule is a powerful weapon, and I think we need more of it.
Would just like to start by saying thank you for being here, and it is a pleasure to be here, being from Alabama. I'm not used to being. I'm not used to being around.
I too am from Alabama.
Ma'am?
Yeah, I too am from Alabama.
Oh, okay.
Just
not used to seeing this many enlightened minds in one place, that's for sure. But I would just like to ask you a question on a evolutionary psychology standpoint. Do you believe that reoccurring suicidal tendencies in some individuals could be a form of neurological natural selection?
I'm having trouble understanding.
Okay,
Sorry.
what he said was, do you believe that reoccurring suicidal tendencies could
in
be...
a form of neurological natural selection?
Natural
Is
selection.
that a form of neurological natural
Now that we've
selection?
outgrown survival, evolution itself is evolving in a more neurological sense.
I'm now hearing it, but I'm still not understanding it. Suicide as a form of natural selection, you mean, how could that be?
Neurological natural selection. Say we're not running from lions and tigers and bears anymore. Now we're running from personal thoughts, stuff like that. We're more protected of the outside world, but not so much of the inside world.
But how is that natural selection? I mean, it's
Just some form of it. Natural selection is the best two words I've got for you.
I think that's a different... I don't think that's actually what natural selection
No, it isn't.
means.
Okay, I'm sorry, but
I mean, it's a form of death.
right.
But I mean, natural selection is selective death, which removes certain genes from the population and allows other genes
Suicidal
to
tendencies.
survive. So, if there are genetic tendencies to suicide, and they cause people to kill themselves before they reproduce, then there would be a genetic tendency. A natural selection, an evolutionary tendency for suicide to go away. That would be natural selection.
I think what you're asking, and I think we'll move on because perhaps it is unanswerable in this context, is suicide a correct, is somehow adaptation to circumstances?
A way of our genes
But
saying,
Well,
No, that-
it couldn't
made it
be.
too far.
That's not the way natural selection works. I mean, that could only be true if you were
Because
saying
it
something
ends
like
poorly.
it's good for the species or something like that, which is not the way natural selection works.
How about religion as selection? Religion as selection.
You know, I think we're going to wait on
Appreciate
that
it.
because we did have people in line for questions, but and so forgive me for not taking that as a question. Yes.
Thank you for being here. As a strong critic of religion, I feel
honor
like
that.
our job's gotten a lot harder with the rise of Donald Trump and the far right. In the vein of, the Ben Afflecks getting lumped in with like racists, there's been a big rise of racists. And have you noticed your job getting harder since then and being categorized as kind of more of a bigot and lumped in with the far right? And is there a way to distinguish ourselves from them while still fighting bad ideologies?
I'm not quite sure what you're getting at there. You're saying that the far right fights against what ideology are you thinking of there?
I mean, with there's been a rise in like hatred towards Muslims,
Oh, right,
banning
yes.
them. And
Yes.
I feel like arguing against Islam now kind of...
Oh, I see what you mean. Got it. Yeah. Okay. Yes. This is the argument about the company you keep, and it's extremely disquieting to be ever on the same side as Donald Trump. Is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, quite. I mean, I am against Islamism. I'm against political Islam. I think that it is one of the greatest evils in the world today. But I think that to discriminate against individual Muslims, to talk about preventing individual Muslims from entering the country, is a disgraceful betrayal of everything that this country, and indeed my country, ought to stand for and has stood for. So,
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks both for coming. So when I get into a debate with friends or family, political debate, I often bring up the point that Trump is the symptom, not the problem. And the problem is, our increasing amount of disinformation on the internet, the anonymity of social media, the fact that civics isn't being taught in school anymore. With all these struggles, how do we right the ship? I agree with this gentleman, we need to get in touch with our politicians, but that requires the population to get motivated. So how do we do that?
Yes, I wish I knew. One of the things that the Center for Inquiry is talking about is trying to do something about the false news that is being put about, trying to, I don't know, provide some sort of certification of websites that have some reason, we have some reason to think are reliable. And a tremendous lot of just plain lies is being told, put about, and there's no editorial control as there was before the internet came along. There was a time when to get a letter published in a newspaper, you had to go through a sort of editorial filter, jump through hoops to get a letter published, and not many were published. With the internet, anybody, no matter how stupid, no matter how ignorant, can get their voice out there. And it's not always easy for people to know whether the voice that they're listening to has any credentials, whatever, or whether there's just some motor mouth sounding off. And I think part of the responsibility might lie on people on the sort of, there are kind of gatekeepers, people like Facebook and Twitter, could perhaps do a little bit more to vet the truth of things that are stated. But it is a huge problem, and it's one that's only just sort of crept up on us. And perhaps we haven't really got to grips with the new problems that the internet is raising. It has immense positive potential as well. I mean, I think the internet may be the best hope for countries like Pakistan and Iran, where governments, where the truth as well as falsehood is available to people through the internet, and as computers become cheaper and more available, it possibly is the best hope, but it has a negative as well as a positive side.
Yes.
Hello, I'm a microbiologist. I actually work for the federal government. Your tax dollars pay my salary. Thank you. And I often run into scientists who are rather stupid. And I often don't have a good argument for them. Do you have any kind of short comment that helps bring people to actually looking for true evidence instead of the garbage they find on the internet?
Well, ask what the evidence is. Don't take authority. Don't take the word of an authority as because they say they've got a PhD from some Bible college or something like that. I mean, in fact, don't take authority just because they've got a PhD anywhere, but ask what the evidence is. It's sometimes not easy to evaluate, and sometimes you do have to take a certain amount on authority. I mean, I, for example, as a biologist, am not qualified to judge physics, and so I sort of have to take it on trust. But I do know that my physics colleagues, whom I can't actually follow in detail, I do know that the papers that get published in physics journals have been through the ordeal of peer review, and that findings that are dubious will be repeated and may fail to be repeated. So that the scientific enterprise does have these safeguards built into it, so that even in those cases where we do have to take a certain amount of authority and the trust of authority, we know the procedure that's gone into it. And I suppose many people don't know that. I find it very hard to answer these questions about society, and I ask me a question about science and I'll answer it, but
Thank you.
I'm not a sociologist.
Yes.
Hi, my name is David. Despite the sawtooths in history, First World War, Second, today, democracy and science have made great progress in the last couple hundred years, but I think we've definitely seen with 2016 what happens when we get complacent with democracy and how if we believe just inevitably everything's going to work out in the end, it doesn't. What would you say would be the best way to avoid that fallacy with science, to help support the institutions of science to make sure we're not being apathetic and we're not just thinking it's inevitably going to keep continuing to get better?
I mean, apathy is one of the big problems in democracy, I think, in both Britain and America. A lot of people just don't bother to vote, or they say they're so disillusioned, they just despise all politicians, so they won't vote. I mean, I think it's possibly slightly fair to say if you despise all politicians, go into politics and do it better. Don't just stay at home and refuse to vote. There are people who look at the two candidates on offer and don't like either of them and so stay at home and vote. I mean, one of them is a lot worse than the other. And so it's not a good policy to just refrain from voting because neither candidate is perfect. But that's politics, and you came on to asking about science.
Yeah, just to try to make sure we don't commit that same kind of fallacy with scientific institutions. Kind of what can the layperson do to help ensure that we don't just leave science to its own, that we can actually help ensure that it does keep progressing?
Well,
maybe it's the same answer. Vote.
Yes, and be interested in science. Read Scientific American. Read New Scientist. Take it seriously. It is very interesting. It's fascinating. So don't just leave it to scientists. Read my books.
Thank you.
Yes.
I did read your book about 11 years ago, and it changed my life, so thank you. But I just wanted to say, as a British person in our company, I wanted to express my sympathy for the news tonight out of Manchester. So, anyway, I have a much lighter question. So my question is about evolutionary biology, and it seems to me there's nothing about the human body that needs daily maintenance, especially thorough maintenance, that your life depends on in some way. As Christopher Hitchens used to say, most people died of their teeth. And teeth seem to me something really important in terms of attractiveness to the opposite sex, in terms of getting protein in your body. So I guess my innocent question is, why did our teeth evolve so badly?
Are you a dentist?
No.
I actually once asked my dentist, Mr. Sharp, that question. I had Mr. Sharp before I went on to Mr. Pick. And I asked him that very question. I said, what is it about teeth? I mean, teeth are the one thing that you really do need to give pretty much daily maintenance to. And the one thing that has a special kind of doctor, does nothing else but teeth. And he looked with withering contempt at me and said, have you ever considered the muck that you eat? He retired soon after that. I went on to Mr. Pick, and Mr. Pick took one look at my teeth and said, dear. Who have you been going to? And I said, I've been going to Mr. Sharp. And he said, this is not Mr. Sharp's work. I know Mr. Sharp's work and I respect it. I'd better not say who. Anyway, sorry, that's quite irrelevant. That possibly is the answer. I mean, teeth are the only part of the skeleton which is actually exposed to the outside world, and it has to be because they have to be really, really hard. Yes, I mean, we do eat a lot of sugar, which is extremely bad for teeth. Mind you, sugar's bad for everything, not just teeth. Why do Americans put sugar in everything, in all their dishes? Even in meat stews and things like that. No, I'm afraid I don't know. No doubt there are dentists here who might have ideas.
To be continued, teeth.
Hi,
the next book, perhaps.
My name's William. Professor Dawkins, as someone who was raised in creationism, given the creationist tours of the Denver Natural History Museum in Dinosaur Ridge, I took till my early 20s to finally understand evolution and worked up the courage to go back to school and pursue a degree in physics. And I want to thank you for the role you played in freeing my mind.
Thank you.
Freed from confirmation bias.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, and I have to say how gratifying it is. I hear that from actually many, many people, and I can't tell you how good it makes me feel. Thank you.
My question is, how do we acknowledge the potential biological explanations and evolution explanations for human behavior without weakening the case for equal rights?
Gosh, that needs a bit of unpacking.
What I mean is, so biological explanations behind intelligence could be used for more sinister intentions, such as eugenics.
Right. Okay.
How do we guard against that?
Those kind of equal rights. Okay.
Okay. Well, when you ask a question like, are there genetic differences in intelligence, there more or less got to be, because if you accept that we have evolved from a common ancestor with chimpanzees and we're more intelligent than chimpanzees, during that period of 6 or 7 million years of our evolution from that common ancestor, our brains have been getting bigger and we've presumably been getting more intelligent. That can only have come about because natural selection has had genetic variation to work upon. And so there must have been genetic variation in intelligence, and presumably there still is. Why on earth should there not be? Because there's genetic variation in everything else. And so why not intelligence? That, I think, makes scientific sense. What I do not think is that there is any point in investigating differences in intelligence in different groups of humans, because it doesn't get you anywhere. Nothing. No matters of policy should ever be decided on the basis of such findings. So I would not finance research into differences of that kind. I would accept that they pretty much that there must be variation there is variation in the human species. Whether there's variation between ethnic groups, I don't know, and I don't think we should even investigate. It doesn't get us anywhere. So I don't really think I think I've said all I need to say about that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Professor Dawkins, do you think gene manipulation technologies are a benefit or a detriment to the survival of Homo sapiens, and why?
It's a slightly different question from the rather similar one we had earlier. Benefit to the survival of the species. Well, potentially, I suppose they could be, because theoretically, you could use genetic manipulation techniques to eliminate genetic diseases like hemophilia, Tay-Sachs disease, Huntington's chorea, all these diseases which are and much less serious ones than that. So one could use genetic manipulation to remove those threats. On the other hand, if you start to use genetic manipulation in a positive direction, trying to, as it were, increase intelligence or musical ability or mathematical ability or something of that sort, you might well find yourself in grave trouble. We know from breeding of livestock, breeding of horses and things, that if you breed systematically for one thing, you may tend to lead to detrimental effects in other things. So horses that are bred to be very fast runners are very vulnerable to having their legs broken and that kind of thing. So I could imagine that there could be detrimental effects on the species from the sort of manipulations you're talking about, unless they're very, very carefully planned and thought out.
I'm going to just mention that we have just a few more minutes left for questions, so let's try to keep the questions really tight so we can fit in as many as we can. And I know that some people will not get to ask their questions, and I'm sorry, but we will be out of time in about 8 minutes, so go ahead.
Yes, Professor Dawkins, on the subject of religion, the military, Trump being at the forefront of our nuclear arsenal, I'd like your thoughts on the infiltration of not just Christianity, but an apocalyptic form of Christianity infiltrating our U.S. military, the majority of the clients, which are non-apocalyptic Christians, as highlighted by the Military Religious Freedom Foundation, and I am a service-connected disabled veteran.
I am not in detail familiar with what's going on in the US military, but I think I know what you're talking about. Apocalyptic Christianity is the belief that in the end times, in Armageddon, in prophecies from that most dubious of the biblical books, the book of Revelation, where there are certain religious elements who actively want the end of the world, actively seek the end of the world, actively seek Armageddon, the great chaotic war which will bring the return of Jesus. This, of course, is dangerous if this sort of idea migrates from the minds of a few lunatics into senior military people. And if you're telling me that it already has, then that's very frightening.
Yes, it has. I'm familiar with that case. Yes. I wouldn't know how to speak to the remedy of that, but that has happened. There was a colonel who was involved. Which was the name? I can't remember who it was.
Mikey Weinstein.
Right.
The Military Religious Freedom Foundation.
Right. And it's a long case to explain, but I'm not quite sure that we might be able to speak to a remedy.
That's horrifying, and it's part of the whole malaise which I think all of us here perhaps are interested in trying to do something about, and certainly our foundation is trying to.
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Dawkins. So I've got one question for you. Do you think it's ever possible for us to develop a secular and a universalizable system of morality and ethics? And I ask this because if you believe the AI community, the singularity might be coming really soon. So it's really important for us to develop a system.
Let's stick to the first part of the question.
I'll stick to the first part of the question. Secular morality, we already have it. Most of our morality today is secular. Our morality, things like we don't believe in slavery, we believe in equality of the sexes, we don't send children up chimneys, we try to be kind to animals. Our warfare, such as it happens today, is becoming ever more humane. It may not seem that way, but it's a lot more humane than it was in the Second World War, and even more so the First World War. So we already have greatly improved morality, improved over the centuries morality, which has nothing to do with religion. This is secular. It's due to secular moral philosophy. It's due to law, changes in law, cases in law, parliamentary debate, discussions among just plain people. We are getting much nicer and more moral as the centuries go by, and this has nothing to do with religion. We can say that 21st century morality is identifiably labeled 21st century morality. It's quite different from 100 years ago, 200 years ago. If you look at look at Darwin himself, or at his colleagues like T.H. Huxley, look at Abraham Lincoln in the middle of the 19th century. Those men were in the vanguard, in the forefront of progressive liberal opinion. Yet they were, by modern standards, horribly racist, horribly sexist. We are getting better all the time. It has nothing to do with religion. It is all to do with secular morality.
Thank you. I want to mention one follow-up to the gentleman who spoke a moment ago. The U.S. military has just recognized humanism as an official religion, which gives military members status, an equal status in the military, which is a really important development. And I think it's really important to mention that in this climate right now, that decision could always be reversed. And the Military Association of Atheists and Freethinkers, who represent thousands of active service and retired service members, always need our support. Yes.
Hi, Professor Dawkins. It's a pleasure. So with the rash, just kind of the political climate right now of a lot of fact deniers and science deniers, I've recently heard Bill and I talking about cognitive dissonance being a issue with people who are really having a difficult time accepting facts or science, and using this particular kind of idea that it's going to take years for some of these people to actually be able to make the connection to logical thought. My question to you is there perhaps another way that we could go about this? Because I don't think we have 2 years to spend on every person to get them to effectively understand facts from fiction.
I keep getting questions which I'm not qualified to answer. I'm a biologist. I'm not a sociologist. I'm not a psychologist. I don't have the wisdom to say what you can do to change people's minds. I wish I did. I write my books which lay the facts out, set the evidence out. I do my best to explain things.
Perhaps the answer is to buy one of his books for friends, or people who aren't friends, just to keep spreading,
That
books
wasn't quite the point I was trying to make, but I suppose I'm trying to distance myself from the position of being a kind of wise man who can answer these questions. I can't. I can just put out the facts and the evidence for them, and I can't answer the question, how do you persuade people to overcome their cognitive dissonance? How can you persuade people to accept that facts matter, and that evidence matters? If they don't believe that, where do you start? Sorry.
Let's have one more. I'm so sorry for people with other questions. We're going to take one more question. Make it a good one, no pressure.
Thank you very much. My question is along the same line, so I hope I'm off base here. But one of the best descriptions I've heard of human beings are we're meaning-making machines. We strive and we struggle to make meaning out of things that are meaningless, perhaps. And Viktor Frankl wrote about that in Man's Ultimate Search for Meaning. It's a theme of Kurt Vonnegut's books that I really enjoy. And so my question is, how do you overcome that very innate drive to make meaning out of the meaningless that I think religion offers people? How do you overcome that with science and reason, which doesn't mince words, it doesn't attempt to, put a fluffy coat around things?
Okay.
Well, I think you give better meaning. Science does give meaning. If I'm asked what is the meaning of life, I can give a scientific answer to that. The meaning of life is the propagation of genetic information. But then I can say that humans can personally make up their own meanings, and you can make up a purpose in your life. You give your life meaning. You have ambition. You have drive. You have desire to accomplish things. You have a desire to finish a book or whatever it might be. You want to make people happy. You want to spread happiness in the world. You want to leave the world a better place than you found it. These are all personal meanings that you can give life. The kind of meaning that I would oppose would be the idea that life itself, the universe, has meaning imposed upon it by some kind of supernatural creator. But I think we can, each of us, all of us, derive great comfort from having meaning in our own lives, and we can also derive comfort from understanding the scientific meaning of the world as well.
I think that's a fantastic note. That is a great note to end this part of the evening on, this very meaning-filled evening. Thank you, Richard Dawkins, for being here. Thank you, everyone who came. We are going to go on to book signing.
Can I just say something about
Yes.
that? I feel I have to apologize that we have quite a big audience, and it may be that there'll be rather a lot of books needing to be signed. I've always found that it's not fair on people at the end of the book signing line if they have to wait a very, very long time. And for that reason, would you forgive me if I don't personalize, but just sign my name in books, and also no selfies?
But as we have discussed this, I know that's a little disappointing for some. If you want to take pictures as Richard signs, just so that it doesn't stop the flow of the line, and we would also ask that we just try not to have more questions in the line, because that will also hold things up. I know you're very generous when people put on Twitter and other social media other questions, not to have you spend more time on screens. But for tonight, let's try to stick to the signing. And thank you all so much, and thank you so much for having us.